learn how to do that.
So you can put this right on your shirt.
I don't know. Good? Good?
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
All right, please join me in welcoming Stas.
Hi everyone, my name is Stas. My capstone today is on how Russian state media justifies the war through narratives. The photo on the slide that you can see is an anti-war protest that took place in Moscow in February 2022. The banner reads, "For your freedom and ours." This kind of protests swept all over the country in just the first few months after the invasion from February 24 to May 9th. More than 15,000 people were detained in relation to such protests. Today, however, the street from the photo stands empty. Massive protests have been reduced to solitary pickets. Public discussion of the war has turned into silence, or worse, silent approval. I am from Ukraine, but I have relatives in Russia, and I believe that Ukrainians and Russians, they share a lot in common. They share a lot of common culturally, linguistically, historically. So I kept wondering, if they're so close as people, why did so many Russians stop speaking out against the war? This question led me to this research. My goal is to understand how the Russian government tries to control media and how that affects what people believe about the war. I also wanted to compare how state media and opposition media tell completely different stories about the same conflict. Moving into context, since the war began, the government control over the media landscape in Russia has grown a lot. The Kremlin's goal is simple: to control what people know about the invasion and how they interpret this event, to mobilize people for the needs of the war. And the one way of doing it is by introducing new laws, like the foreign agent law. Foreign agent law is if you are a public figure or an influencer and you speak out against the war, the government can label you a foreign agent. This means they say you're working for or funded by another countries. And once that label sticks, you face big consequences like losing advertising money, legal problems, and social pressure. And the sign that you see on the slide is the one that every foreign agent must display by the law. And that's just one tactic they use. They also blocked meta platforms like Instagram and Facebook. They passed a disinformation law that punishes people for criticizing military, and used many other laws and digital tools to suppress opposition. But the Kremlin isn't just blocking opposition. It fills the space with its own narratives. It creates the narratives it wants people to believe. So my research set out to ask, what are those narratives? And how do they compare to what the opposition says? And to answer that, I turned to past research. Of course, highlighting the most important here in my presentation, one being from Benoit from 2015, who created something called image repair theory, which shows how government protect their reputation during crisis. Another one being by Nguyen and colleagues, who in 2024 applied this image repair theory to study how Russian state media justified the war using strategies like evasion of responsibility and denial. And finally, Waltmer and Wasserman from 2014, who introduced the idea of media dualism, when state media and opposition media both exist, but they tell completely different stories affecting different audiences who often don't overlap. Here's what I have noticed. A lot of studies focus only on state media. Others look just on opposition outlets. Some analyze social media posts or focus on legal tools used to silence the speech. But almost no one compares two sides directly, state media versus opposition media. And no one really breaks down the specific narratives state media uses to justify the war, or how opposition media tries to push back. So I formed my research question to be, how has the Russian state framed its representation of Ukraine in news media since February 24, 2022 to justify the ongoing war? To find out, I used qualitative content analysis. This means I read through real articles and analyzed them to look for patterns. In total, I compared 12 articles, 6 from state media like RIA Novosti and Russia Today, and 6 from opposition media like Meduza and Novaya Gazeta Europe. The articles were published from 2022 to 2025. I chose the ones that talked about the war, its causes, and what different sides had to say about it. My goal was to find out how does each side tell the story, and what are they trying to make the audience to believe. To do that, I created 7 key criteria to examine each article. I based these criteria on ideas from Benoit, Newman, and others. And here are the 7. Framing of Ukraine and its government, justification of the war, depiction of military enactions, portrayal of the West and NATO, historical and cultural narratives, depiction of the Russian state and military, censorship and control of opposition narratives. This gave me a structure for comparing how each article talked about these themes. It also let me see where patterns started to appear. The results were later arranged in a comparative table. Here is a simplified version of my comparative table. It shows one article from each source, but my full table had 12 entries. Each row answers 7 questions for that article. This made it easier to track which narratives were being repeated and which one were being challenged. For example, I highlighted contrasting narratives. I wish I could have zoomed in, but next time. Going through what I have found. I will go through each criteria question, generalizing what I have found. First, being framing of Ukraine. State media says Ukraine is corrupt and full of extremists. Opposition media calls it sovereign, democratic, and under attack. Second, being justification of the war. State media says the war is about self-defense and protecting Russian speakers. Opposition says it's an illegal invasion harming civilians. Third, Ukraine's military. State calls them chaotic militants. Opposition calls them disciplined, under-equipped defenders. The West and NATO. State calls them divided and unreliable. Opposition calls them critical support system for Ukraine. 5, being historical narratives. State media often uses World War II narratives to call Ukrainian officials Nazis. And opposition often reminds audiences of Russia's past invasions, like those in Syria or Chechnya. 6, Russian state and military. State calls them peacekeepers. Opposition calls them as aggressors responsible for war crimes. And finally, 7, censorship. State says that Ukraine censors Russians, and opposition reports on how Russia actually suppresses the speech, journalism, and protest. Moving to discussion, you may wonder, what does it all mean? As I have wondered. So the media in Russia isn't just reporting on the war. It is creating different versions of the same reality. State media tries to justify the war using fear, patriotism, and moral arguments. Opposition media tries to undo that by showing what is happening to civilians, talking about free speech and international law. This fits what Woltmer and Wasserman call media dualism, when two totally different realities exist, but they rarely overlap. And people choose the one that fits with what they already believe. In short, the media divide is helping to create an ideological divide in Russian society. Moving on to implications. You may wonder, why does this matter? And there are two big takeaways that I thought matter. First, regarding understanding international disinformation, because if we can identify the techniques that Russia uses to justify the war, we can also recognize them in other countries and even in our own home countries. And second, being media literacy, because the 7 criteria that I used, I believe, can help everyday reader to evaluate news stories. Because you don't have to be a researcher to ask who is blamed, what emotions are being used, what history is referenced. These tools can help us think more critically and avoid falling for propaganda. Of course, there are some limitations that should be acknowledged. One being small sample size. I analyzed only 12 articles. It's a small piece of a huge media landscape. Second, I analyzed only written text. I didn't include video, TV, or social media, where a lot of emotional influence happens. Third, being platform constraints. Many opposition voices speak through Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Telegram, which I did not include. And final, being interpretation. Even with the set criteria, different readers might see things differently. That's the nature of analyzing stories and tone, and so interpretation may vary across the readers. With this, here are my works cited. And questions. So the process was, I found an article, and then I read through the article myself, highlighting and answering each of those 7 questions that I presented. And I filled the table. And I had one table for each article that I have analyzed. And later, it's all been transformed into one huge generalized article where I took all the patterns that appeared. For example, it is pretty often to call the government of Ukraine in Russian state media Nazis. And that's how they frame it. That's a real word. So I take it down and I put it on the table. If I said that Russian state media said that they have support from the West, I probably said something wrong, because they definitely don't. Yeah. I believe it wouldn't start in Russia. I believe it started a long time ago, but things would have been different if government intervention wouldn't be so deep into Russian society. And as a part of also Russian cultural society, because I grew up reading the same books and watching the same YouTube videos, the ones that they watch in Russia. I kind of understand. I'm into it. So yeah.
The United States has recently cut funding, cut programs
Thank you. Of course, I have heard about Voice of America, especially in the past, in the Soviet Union times, and after the collapse, the Voice of America was the main voice of the West that a lot of people in the post-Soviet Union used as a primary source. Later, it have lost its primarity, and now there are many other sources that people use. So, of course, that now the funding is cut. There is a oppositional media is more weakened, but not critically. Not critically, I think, yes.